Ancient Vedic texts hold stunning information. There are over 400,000 different types of humanoid life forms in the universe. This colossal figure forces us to confront a fundamental question that science often sidesteps. Among this unimaginable variety, is humanity, as we know it today, truly the only species to have ever fully claimed the Earth? Or was our planet once a shared home for multiple civilizations, now relegated to the realm of myths and forgotten legends? The Vedas don't just list these forms, they clearly classify them. There are those on a path of evolution and development, similar to humans and higher beings, and those representing degrading branches of life, creatures often mentioned in folklore as the undead or denizens of lower worlds, yet possessing a frighteningly recognizable human appearance. We will not indulge in empty guessing or retell modern fantasies. Our goal is to turn to real chronicles of the past and see if such life was present on our planet, not just as isolated incidents, but systematically. To do this, we will dig up manuscripts from the Middle Ages and documents that our ancestors trusted. Before we reveal the contents of ancient maps and chronicles capable of shattering accepted timelines, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like this content. The information you are about to learn has the power to completely overturn your understanding of history. To separate fiction from fact, we will look at sources whose significance for their time cannot be doubted. We are talking about the educational textbooks used to teach the children of the Tsar during the time of Ivan the Terrible. These were not collections of fairy tales for entertainment, but serious manuals that shaped the worldview of future rulers. In these documents, which describe events from over 2,000 years ago, the famous campaign of Alexander the Great is recorded in detail. However, the world that revealed itself to the conqueror was radically different from the one painted by modern textbooks. Historical compilations testify that the great commander encountered not only foreign armies of men on his path, but also creatures whose very existence seems impossible today. If such encounters were merely singular inventions, they would not be repeated with such persistence in serious literature. Yet, not only Russian Tsareviches, but the entire European nobility were taught using similar books for centuries after Alexander's campaigns. This knowledge was considered fact, not legend. European sources of that time echo the Russian Chronicles. Alexander's army engaged in battle with giants, possessing only one eye in their forehead, cyclopes. And this description was so mundane for the chroniclers that it caused no surprise, forcing us to wonder, perhaps the famous story of Odysseus blinding the Cyclops has a much firmer historical foundation than is commonly believed. Studying the Illustrated Chronicle compilation, created specifically for the education of heirs to the throne during the time of Ivan the Terrible, reveals a picture of the world strikingly different from the modern one. It is important to understand the status of this document. It is not a collection of entertaining novellas or fiction. It was an encyclopedia, the sum of all knowledge of that era, the foundation upon which the education of future sovereigns was built. If the information contained therein were considered fiction, its presence in textbooks for the elite would have been not just pointless, but dangerous. For a ruler must rely on the real state of things, not on fantasies. Nevertheless, the biography of Alexander the Great in these folios is teeming with details that are today customarily relegated to the category of myths. In these chronicles, the great commander appears not just as a conqueror of human kingdoms. His path is blocked by creatures possessing completely different physiological traits. The texts describe not chance encounters, but full-scale military clashes and complex interactions with various forms of life. What is striking is that such information is not a unique feature of Russian chronicles alone. European nobility was educated for centuries using similar books. For instance, French sources from the early 15th century recounting the same events duplicate the descriptions of these creatures with frightening accuracy. This suggests that for more than 2,000 years after Alexander's campaigns, there was a consensus in the educated circles of Europe and Asia. Humanity was not the only intelligent race on the planet. These descriptions were so detailed and ubiquitous that to ignore them is to accuse thousands of chroniclers, cartographers, and historians of the past of collective insanity. In the Chronicles, Alexander enters into battle with giants, whose appearance causes shock. A special place among them is occupied by cyclopes. Unlike poetic metaphors, historical documents describe them as a real people, possessing their own hierarchy and military power. They are depicted as creatures of colossal height, which forces us to look at famous ancient stories in a completely different light. If textbooks for monarchs, upon whom the fates of empires depended, described battles with one-eyed giants in black and white, it means that at that time it was perceived as part of objective reality, as reliable as the existence of elephants or camels. Here arises a legitimate question that becomes a bridge between history and biology. Modern man is accustomed to considering cyclopes exclusively as characters from fairy tales, yet ancient authors such as Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD described them in their works on natural history alongside ordinary African tribes. These creatures appeared on geographical maps of Africa right up to modern times. Entire nations were described whose king had only one eye, or tribes with heads resembling dogs. These types of living beings were included in cartographic atlases for 2,300 years, starting from Alexander's campaigns. Could such a long tradition be based on nothing? Or is there something more behind these images than just the fantasy of ancient travelers? Perhaps a genetic branch or life form that was displaced or destroyed in the course of history. We are approaching the edge where familiar history ends and the forgotten biology of our planet begins. Turning to the legacy of Pliny the Elder, author of the famous Natural History written back in the 1st century AD, we find detailed reports on the tribes inhabiting Africa. Among the multitude of peoples, the Roman scholar quite casually describes those whose king possessed only one eye in his forehead. This information did not vanish into oblivion with the fall of the Roman Empire. On the contrary, it was carefully carried over from century to century, cemented in documents that served as the main sources of knowledge about the world. Cartographers and explorers for more than 2,000 years included these species of living beings on maps of Africa and other continents. These were not allegorical drawings in the margins. These were designations of real territories inhabited by specific peoples. In the age of discovery, when the world began to expand rapidly, these creatures did not disappear from maps, but on the contrary, acquired new coordinates. In the cosmography of Guillaume de Testu, dated 1555, one can find clear indications of Cyclops habitats in Africa. Moreover, other cosmographies of the early 16th century, for example, works from 1508, testify to the global distribution of this species, pointing to the existence of cyclopes not only on the Dark Continent, but also in the newly discovered Brazil. Cartographers of that time, risking their reputation, recorded these data, marking them as objective fact. Here live humans, and here, one-eyed giants. Such geographical specificity makes one doubt that all this was merely a figment of the imagination. Modern science attempts to rationalize these ancient testimonies by pointing to a known medical phenomenon, cyclopia. Indeed, medicine confirms that such a congenital pathology exists. It is a rare developmental disorder in which the eye orbits do not separate into two cavities. Statistics state that such cases occur, albeit rarely, 1 in 16,000 births, or even less frequently, depending on the classification. Skulls with such anomalies are kept in anatomical museums, and this is no secret to science. It would seem the answer is found. The ancients simply saw sick people and composed legends about them. However, a fundamental contradiction lies here that is impossible to ignore. Medical cyclopia is a severe deviation, often incompatible with life or leading to the early death of the organism. It is the tragedy of an individual, not the trait of an entire race. Historical chronicles and maps describe not dying infants and not isolated invalids, but powerful warlike tribes of giants, capable of waging fierce wars with the armies of Alexander the Great. It is impossible to build a civilization on a lethal mutation. The description of entire nations, their kings, and their geographical distribution indicates that this was a stable genetic line, a fully fledged species that existed in parallel with humanity. And if the existence of one-eyed giants can still be attempted to be written off as a distorted perception of disease, then how to explain testimonies about creatures whose anatomy completely contradicts human nature and defies any medical diagnosis? Next, we will encounter forms of life that science categorically refuses to recognize, despite their ubiquitous presence in culture. If modern science still tries to attribute the existence of cyclopes to rare genetic failures, the phenomenon of centaurs puts researchers at a complete dead end. From a medical point of view, the combination of a human torso and a horse's body is impossible. Yet historical chronicles assert the opposite with frightening unanimity. Centaurs, or as they were called in the Slavic tradition, polkans and kitovras, were not just characters of ancient myths locked in the era of ancient Greece. Their images and mentions permeate culture thoroughly, appearing in places where, it would seem, pagan monsters have no place at all. In sacred Christian texts and on the walls of temples. Take a look at European psalters from the 14th century. These are liturgical books used by believers for prayer, and on their pages, next to holy texts, medieval miniaturists quite calmly depicted centaurs. This was not considered heresy or desecration of the shrine. Moreover, records have been preserved of the travels of holy hermits who describe their encounters with these creatures as a mundane fact. One chronicle, describing a monk's journey to Egypt, tells how he met a centaur and, not at all frightened, asked for directions. And the creature did not attack, did not vanish, but calmly showed the traveler the right way. Such interaction suggests that centaurs were perceived not as mindless monsters, but as an intelligent form of life capable of communication. This tradition did not bypass Russia either. On the facades of white stone temples erected in the 12th to 17th centuries, one can find numerous bas-reliefs depicting kitovras, creatures with the body of a lion or horse, the head of a human, and wings. If the church considered them a demonic delusion, such images would have been ruthlessly chipped off the walls. But they remained, peacefully coexisting with the faces of saints, which testifies to the deep conviction of our ancestors in the reality of these creations. They were part of God's world, just like humans or animals. The geography of this phenomenon is striking in its scope. Testimonies about centaurs are not limited to Europe or the Middle East. When studying ancient burials in China, on the fabrics in which mummies of white people aged over 4,000 years were wrapped, distinct images of centaurs were also discovered. These creatures are recorded in the art of Pompeii, on the villas of Italian nobility, and in cosmographies describing the fauna of distant Australia. Everywhere, from ancient frescoes to medieval maps, they appear as warriors, hunters, and even helpers of humans, protecting them from wild beasts. Such a global and detailed presence of mythical creatures in documentary sources of different civilizations forces us to admit, either all of humanity suffered from identical hallucinations for millennia, or we do not know something about our planet's past. But centaurs, for all their exoticism, were merely the tip of the iceberg. Maps and traveler reports hide even stranger creations, whose appearance seems like a mockery of the usual laws of nature. And it is to them that we must turn to understand the true scale of the biological diversity of the ancient world. If centaurs and cyclopes might seem to some like echoes of ancient, long-gone eras, the study of medieval maps and chronicles reveals a veritable global bestiary, the diversity of which is capable of shocking a modern biologist. The geography of these testimonies is not limited to some single, enchanted region. It covers practically the entire known world of that time. Travelers whose names are inscribed in gold letters in the history of geographical discovery, such as Marco Polo, described their encounters with creatures whose anatomy seems absurd today, but back then was part of a harsh reality. One of the most common species mentioned in the annals were the cynocephali, people with dog heads. Pliny the Elder wrote about these creatures with scientific scrupulousness in the 1st century AD, claiming that entire tribes of such creations inhabited Africa. More than 1,000 years later, in the 14th century, the famous Venetian Marco Polo, traveling through the Mongol Empire and Tartary, also recorded their presence. For people of that time, dog-headed men were not monsters from nightmares. They were neighbors one had to reckon with, trade with, or fight against. The most striking proof that the existence of cynocephaly was recognized at the highest level is the history of Saint Christopher. Until recently, Orthodox iconography and frescoes depicted this revered saint precisely as a man with a dog's head. This was not an allegory of faithfulness to the creed, as some modern theologians try to explain. Ancient texts directly speak of his origin from a race of dog-headed people. If the Church canonized such a creature, it means the very fact of the existence of an intelligent race with dog heads caused no cognitive dissonance among the clergy and the flock. They were part of the divine plan, creations just like us. But nature's fantasy, captured in documents, went even further. In cosmographies of the 16th century, for example in the works of Guillaume de Testu, inhabitants of distant lands possessing incredibly large ears are described. These creatures, spotted in different corners of the world, from India to Australia, were described with domestic details that are hard to invent. Their ears were so huge that the Aborigines used them instead of clothing or blankets. To protect their bodies from the night chill, they literally wrapped themselves in their own ears. These descriptions migrate from one book to another, from one map to another, over centuries. We see them in the Nuremberg Chronicles, in the libraries of the Vatican, and in the travel notes of hermits. Such a global spread of information, from sweltering Africa to the unexplored shores of Australia, suggests that the Earth's biosphere in the past was inhabited by a multitude of intelligent species that coexisted, fought, and interbred with each other. And among this motley variety of monsters and hybrids, one character got lost, who, unlike the dog-headed men and the big-eared people, did not disappear completely from the pages of our history. He continues to be sought in mountain forests today, called by different names, but ancient chronicles knew him by a very specific appearance. And it is about him that we will speak next. For the proofs of his existence lie in those very same medieval archives. Among the multitude of mysterious creatures inhabiting the pages of ancient chronicles, there is one character who, unlike many others, has not vanished from our consciousness completely. We know him as the snowman, Yeti, Sasquatch, or Bigfoot. Modern science and mass culture have turned him into an elusive ghost, an object of ridicule and endless TV shows where researchers wander through forests looking for broken branches. However, if we cast aside modern skepticism and turn to documents from 500 years ago, we discover that for our ancestors, this ghost was a completely tangible historical reality, recorded with the same precision as the existence of neighboring nations. The problem with modern perception often lies in the difficulties of translation and interpretation. The name Bigfoot itself is a literal translation that stuck to a creature with disproportionately large feet. In medieval texts, such as the previously mentioned stories about the campaigns of Alexander the Great, these creatures were described as hairy men or forest savages of gigantic stature. Illustrations in manuscripts and carvings on European cathedrals of that time show them quite casually. Powerful figures covered from head to toe in thick hair, inhabiting mountainous terrain. They did not hide in caves, afraid to show themselves. On the contrary, historical compilations narrate that Alexander's armies engaged in open battles with them. These Bigfoots of the past were serious opponents. Chronicles describe them as creatures possessing immense physical strength and primitive but effective weapons. Encounters with them were not random, brief episodes. They were full-scale military conflicts, where the antique army faced organized resistance from the forest people. The fact that images of these hairy giants adorn the walls of Christian cathedrals in Europe speaks volumes. A medieval person entering a temple saw them in stone and perceived them as part of the created world, made by God on par with other peoples. This was not folklore in our understanding. It was the ethnography of that time. Cosmographies of the 16th century, which we relied on earlier, also place snowmen on maps of India and other regions. Their proximity to dog-headed men and cyclopes creates a picture of a world overpopulated with various forms of intelligent life. But it is here, looking at this unimaginable variety of species, from snake people to hairy giants and dog-headed men, that the most important and disturbing question arises. Evolution, as it is taught to us, works slowly and sequentially. It does not create such a quantity of radically different humanoid species simultaneously on one planet. Where did this biological chaos come from? Why did creatures seemingly assembled from parts of different animals exist on Earth at the same time? The answer to this question lies deeper than medieval maps. It is hidden in the cradle of human civilization, in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, which hold the frightening secret of the origin of these species. To understand the origins of that incredible biological diversity recorded on medieval maps and in ancient chronicles, we need to transport ourselves to the very cradle of human civilization, to ancient Mesopotamia. It is here, in the sands of Sumer, that archaeologists have discovered thousands of artifacts that do not fit into the classical theory of evolution. We are talking about the famous figurines of the Ubaid period, the age of which exceeds 6,000 years. These figurines depict creatures with human bodies but with the heads of reptiles or snakes. What is especially frightening about these finds is their domestic nature. Lizard-like women hold infants in their arms, nurse them, and exist in a mundane setting. It does not look like images of terrible deities demanding worship. It looks more like sketches from the life of another species living side by side with humans. Ancient cuneiform texts, which science often perceives as metaphorical epics, upon a more detailed and literal reading, reveal a picture resembling a report on the work of a high-tech laboratory. Knowledge preserved not only in Sumer, but also in the Vedic texts of India, Egypt, and even among the ancient Slavs, speaks of the same thing. Many of the creatures we consider monsters were created artificially. The texts describe the arrival of gods, or beings from other star systems. A connection to the Andromeda Nebula is often mentioned, who began conducting large-scale genetic experiments on Earth. According to these translations, biological material from primates, brought from Africa, from the territories of modern Zimbabwe, was used to create new species. The goal of these manipulations was not simple curiosity, but the creation of specialized hybrids, a kind of biological weapon or ideal servants. These creatures were given specific properties. One of the key concepts encountered in these texts is androgyny, being dual-sexed. Creatures are described who, depending on the phases of the moon or other cycles, could manifest both male and female traits. This feature made them unique for survival and reproduction, but alien to the original earthly nature. Legends about snake people, nagas, and other hybrids are, in essence, a distorted memory of the results of those very genetic experiments, when other, alien components were mixed with human DNA. The most disturbing thing about this ancient history is that it did not end thousands of years ago. Genetic experiments of such scale could not pass without a trace for the planet's biosphere. The created hybrids did not disappear overnight. They lived, interacted, and, most importantly, interbred with the indigenous population of the Earth. We are used to thinking that humanity is monolithic, but ancient knowledge asserts the opposite. The legacy of those very laboratories may flow in our veins. These experiments left an indelible mark on the physiology of modern man, and the proofs of this are not in museums, but inside each of us. You may consider this fiction, but your own body holds secrets that official science cannot clearly explain, and the most obvious marker of this ancient intervention is your blood. Modern medicine and genetics, despite their colossal achievements, still stand at a dead end before the riddles hidden in human blood. If we accept the hypothesis of ancient intervention and the creation of hybrid life forms, then many inexplicable medical facts suddenly acquire a frightening logic. The main anomaly pointed out by proponents of this theory lies in the reesus factor. Statistics are relentless. The overwhelming majority of the planet's population, about 85%, has a positive reesus factor. This is considered the norm, a common biological marker linking us to primates and natural earthly evolution. However, there remain 15% of people with a negative reesus factor, whose origin science cannot clearly explain. Their blood seems to carry a different, alien program. Most dramatically, this difference manifests in the phenomenon of reesus disease. This is the only case in nature where a mother's body rejects its own child, perceiving it as a foreign body, as a virus, or a threat that needs to be destroyed. If a woman with a negative reesus carries a child with a positive one, her immune system begins to produce antibodies to attack the fetus. Medicine has learned to manage this process, but the very fact of such a biological war inside the womb screams that we are dealing with an attempt to mix two genetically incompatible species. This is direct confirmation of ancient texts stating that humanity is not a monolithic species, but carries traces of artificial crossbreeding. Even more mysterious is blood type AB, type 4. Doctors claim that it appeared relatively recently, no more than 6,000 years ago, which strangely coincides with the time of the rise of the Sumerian civilization and the experiments described there. This blood has unique properties. Its carriers are universal recipients, meaning they can receive any other blood, but their own blood is often fatal to others. This surprisingly echoes the description of the biological weapons of antiquity, creatures created to be ideal adapters. Ancient Vedic sources shed light on the nature of these creations. They were described as creatures possessing the ability to mimic. The main feature of the bred hybrids was their ability to outwardly copy the race in whose environment they lived. Settling among dark-skinned peoples, over generations they became indistinguishable from them outwardly. Living among whites, they acquired European features. Like chameleons, they dissolved into the human mass, becoming one of us for any nation. However, while copying the outer shell, they remained different on an internal, energetic level. In esoteric texts, they are called empty people. This definition carries no offensive connotation. It merely states a fact. The artificially created creature lacks that deep, energetic structure present in a naturally born human. These are ideal biological machines carrying the program of ancient creators. They live among us, look like us, speak like us, but their blood holds the memory of past laboratories. The mixing of these different genetic lines, occurring over millennia, led to the original laws of species purity being forgotten. We stopped understanding who is who, and this loss of knowledge about the nature of our own blood and energy has led humanity to the line beyond which begin irreversible consequences for the health of the entire civilization. It is about this price of ignorance that remains to be discussed. We stand before a global historical paradox that requires comprehension. Just yesterday, by the standards of human history, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the existence of other forms of life was not just a matter of faith, but a documented fact reflected in navigational maps, church books, and textbooks for the elite. Today, it is customary to be ironic about this knowledge, calling it fairy tales for children. But ask yourself a question. Why was this operation to cleanse memory conducted with such thoroughness? Why were hundreds of thousands of testimonies relegated to the category of myths? The answer, perhaps, lies in the fact that ignorance is the ideal tool of control. Turning reality into a fairy tale was done intentionally so that humanity would forget its origins, stop asking uncomfortable questions about its ancestry, and accept a simplified, safe model of the world, where man has always been the crown of creation and the sole master of the planet. However, we are paying a terrible price for this oblivion right now. The refusal to understand ancient genetic laws and the ignoring of the fact of mixing different biological species have led to modern society facing an avalanche of genetic diseases and congenital pathologies, before which even the most advanced medicine is powerless. Ancient texts warned, mixing the blood of different species, violating the energetic structure inherent to each race, leads to degeneration. What we call hereditary diseases today, the sudden appearance of new autoimmune ailments, and the growth in the number of children born with severe deviations, this is a direct consequence of that chaotic genetic cocktail that has been bubbling in the veins of humanity for the last millennia. We live in a world where physiological incompatibility has become the norm, and doctors are forced to introduce compatibility tests for marriage, not even suspecting that the roots of this incompatibility go back to the times of Sumerian laboratories. A huge number of people suffer from diseases of the blood and immune system simply because their body tries to reject alien programs written in their own DNA. Knowledge about the energetic basis of blood, about the differences between star seedings and artificially created hybrids, was erased to hide the very fact that among us live the descendants of those very experiments, outwardly indistinguishable but internally different. And until we admit that the history of Earth was far more complex and diverse than what is written in a school textbook, we will continue to look for cures for the consequences while ignoring the cause. The truth is that the past does not disappear. It is dissolved in our blood. Studying forbidden history is not just curiosity. It is the key to survival and understanding who we truly are. Descendants of gods, or the result of someone else's experiment. If you want to know more about forbidden history that schools won't tell you, and are ready to look even deeper down the rabbit hole, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss future investigations, and write in the comments, what is your blood type? Perhaps therein lies the solution to your personal history. Until we meet again.